to the exhibit hall where I am joined with my good friend, Dr. Jeff Walline. And so many people yesterday asked about atropine. There were tons and tons of questions, and Jeff is a true expert on this topic. So I'm really happy that we are kicking off day 2 with this entire topic just on atropine because we had so many questions. Before we begin, make sure that you are asking Dr. Walline questions in the chat box. I will try to ask him as many questions as we can at the end of the event. So we will make some time for questions and answers. So I know a lot of you guys had questions yesterday. Please plug those back into the chat box during Dr. Walline's talk. And thank you so much, Dr. Walline, for joining us today and kicking off day 2 of Eyes on Myopia.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. I really appreciate the invitation. And as you said, I actually really like questions. I learn as much from them as anybody, so look forward to trying to answer them. Before I begin, I should give my disclosures. My only disclosure is that from Bausch & Lomb, I did receive research materials, contact lens solutions for our bifocal lenses in nearsighted kids, or BLINK study that's sponsored by the National Eye Institute. So we're going to talk specifically about low concentration atropine. And the way I'm going to do it is by evidence-based information. And I want to show you just sort of the layout of my slides so that you kind of understand what I'm trying to get across to you each time. So you're going to see some data presented in some form, whether it be a table or figure from a variety of different studies. You're going to see where the source of that material actually came from. And then over here on the left, I'm putting the takeaway point that I want you to take away from that particular study, because I think that's the important part of the study. So this first study that we're actually taking a look at was sort of the evidence, the first evidence to show that 0.01% atropine actually slows myopia progression. Interestingly, these are 2 different studies presented on one table. The first study was placebo versus 1% atropine that you see here in the triangles. The second study, they were randomly assigned to 0.05, 0.1, or 0.01% atropine, with 0.01% atropine being the control group. So what you want to do is you want to make the control group as close to the experimental group as possible. So they put them in 0.01% atropine, assuming that it wouldn't have absolutely any effect on myopia progression. But when they plotted the results against the second study, the 1% versus placebo, they actually found that even 0.01% atropine slows myopia progression. And that was the first time that we really found something like that. And I think what led to where we're at today in terms of using low concentration atropine for myopia progression. They then went further. The last graph I showed you was through 2 years, so it was this point right here, but then they extended the study for an additional year for all of those participants, for the ones that were on placebo and 1% atropine, and then the ones that were on 0.5, 0.1, and 0.01%. But what they did is during this last year, during the 24 to 36 months, they took them all off treatment. And here's an important finding and why we think that low concentration atropine is so important for myopia control. In this particular study, they found that there was almost no rebound effect with 0.01% atropine. But the higher the concentration, the greater the rebound effect you got, so that ultimately at the end of a 3-year study, 2 years on treatment, 1 year off, there wasn't much of a difference, and I honestly don't remember if this is statistically significant or not, but there wasn't as much of a difference between placebo and 1% atropine as there was between placebo and 0.01% atropine. So that sort of led to the idea that not only is 0.01% atropine provides sufficient myopia control, but there's less rebound, so it's probably ultimately a better treatment than the higher concentrations of atropine that also cause more significant side effects. But there is one bit of caution that people should have related to low concentration atropine, 0.01% atropine. So here I'm showing the results of, again, those 2 studies. But what I want you to take away from it is this is what happens to eye growth on 1% atropine. These are what happens to eye growth on placebo and the lower concentrations of atropine. And you can see that there's basically no difference between in eye growth between 0.01% atropine and placebo. So somehow 0.01% atropine slows myopia progression, but it doesn't slow eye growth. So what does it change? Maybe it changes the ciliary tonus of the ciliary muscle, and which leads to a decrease in myopia. But you would think that would lead to a greater rebound effect. So we really don't think that that's it. But we also don't really know how it could slow myopia progression without slowing eye growth. And so it's one of the questions that remains and is important, I think, as we go through myopia control in the future, especially with these low concentration atropines. So once they figured out that low concentration atropine was effective at slowing myopia progression, they wanted to take a look at various low concentrations of atropine. So in this particular study, you see the growth of the eye with placebo plotted in yellow, with 0.01% atropine plotted in gray, 0.025 in orange, and 0.05 in blue. And so what this ultimately shows you is that 0.05% atropine does a better job of slowing eye growth. And the graph, except for it's in the opposite direction, but the graph for refractive error looks almost exactly the same. So based on this, a lot of people have switched from 0.01 to 0.05 because 0.05 does seem to do a better job of slowing eye growth. Now, interestingly, there was a study that was completed recently and reported, the CHAMP study. And this was a study where they randomly assigned children to 0.01% atropine and 0.02% atropine. And the interesting finding from this study was that 0.02% atropine did not significantly slow myopia progression, but 0.01% did. It's a finding that's really difficult to explain. We really don't know the reason why 0.02 wouldn't work, but 0.01 would. But hopefully this will lead to an application to the FDA for a product that slows myopia progression. And a little bit later, I'm actually going to talk about why that is really important. And it has to do with where we actually ultimately get the atropine from and the consistency of the drug that we get and we give to our patients. But I think these are important findings. It's just that there's something a little bit confusing about the findings, and we've got to do more work to try and figure out why that may ultimately be. And then recently, another clinical trial was completed, and that's a PDIG study, Pediatric Eye Disease Investigator Group study, where they're looking at 0.01% atropine myopia control here in the United States. But those results have not been posted yet, so I don't know what the ultimate outcome is. But I think they'll be very important in terms of what we can do with low concentration atropine and how it affects our patients here in the United States, as opposed to all the previous studies which have been conducted in Asia. Now, this figure is something that I've created, and it's very confusing at the beginning, so I'm going to take some time to try and explain it to you. Across the bottom here, you see a variety of studies, and what I've done is I've indicated the studies by the first author and the year that it was actually published, so that you can have a chance of finding it in the literature. And then I put a comma, and then I've put the concentration of atropine that was actually studied in that particular study. So you can see the concentration across here. I've divided the studies up into 2-year-long studies, these two right here, and 1-year studies, all of these. So most of these low concentration atropine studies are just 1-year studies. And then if you look at the y-axis, I've got 2 different y-axes. The first one is to explain the difference between the treatment group, which is indicated right here on this graph, so it's 0.01% atropine or 0.02% atropine, and the control group, which is generally placebo, but it might be no treatment in some of these studies. But essentially, you expect the control group to be progressing normally. And the bar here indicates the difference in the dot indicates the difference in axial length, which is indicated here. So the dot for this study is about 0.09 millimeters over a 1-year period. The dot here is at about 0.17 millimeters over a 1-year period. The bars all indicate refractive error, the difference in refractive error between the treatment group and the placebo group. So this bar indicates that over a 1-year period, using 0.01% atropine, they found about 0.6 diopters difference between the treatment group and the other group. So you can see that there's a lot of variability in the results. You can see that by and large, well, and let me make one other quick point before I go on to the individual results. You can actually see that 0.1 millimeters of eye growth equals approximately a quarter of a diopter of refractive error. And that's the general numbers that we try to remember, especially as we do more and more measurement of eye growth in these myopia control studies and also in our clinical practices. So if you don't know how to understand, what eye growth means in terms of dioptric difference, I think this is one sort of average number that you can take away. It doesn't apply across all ages. It's not a linear growth that people have or anything like that, but a roundabout estimation is that for every 1/10 of a millimeter of eye growth, you get about a quarter of a diopter of myopia progression. And so I was able to put these all on one graph this way using that sort of conversion. And if you take the average of all these dots and you weight it by sample size, the average slowing of eye growth across all of these studies is about 0.09 millimeters. That would actually indicate that this line were lower. So this line should actually be a little bit lower, 0.09 millimeters. I may have changed the size of the graph, and that may have changed that. And the difference in refractive error is about 0.37 diopters. And so that actually should be closer to right about here. But what you can see is a difference in refractive error versus axial length. If the difference in axial length is about 0.1 millimeters, you'd expect about 0.25 diopters. It's a little bit more than that. So what this tells us is, since these are primarily 0.01% atropine, we're not quite meeting that decrease in eye growth that we would expect by measuring the decrease in refractive error. But let's put sort of low concentration atropine in comparison to other types of myopia control. So the first one I'm talking about here is multifocal contact lenses. So that's myopia control contact lenses. That's center distance design, where you put two different foci on the back of the retina and measure eye growth with those and measure myopia progression. So this is multifocal contact lenses, is just a generic term. This is orthokeratology contact lenses, where you don't see any change in terms of myopia progression because we don't generally measure it in orthokeratology. So I don't indicate anything there. It's not that it's 0 or less, it's that it's just not measured in those particular studies. This is low concentration atropine. This is red light therapy, which I'm just going to give you a brief description of. Red light therapy, there's been a few studies that have been conducted in Asia where they give young children just 3 minutes of red light therapy, usually with red laser light, where they have them stare basically into a lamp that uses red laser light, 3 minutes twice a day, and they get they report, I should say, a huge myopia control effect. But the big question about these is, are we actually damaging the retina by having kids stare at this bright red light? Because it is a very bright light. So this isn't available in the United States. It probably won't be anytime soon. There's a lot of questions to be answered about this before we go any further with this. But I just wanted to put it sort of on the scale because it is something people are talking about. And then the last one is what I call lenslet spectacles. So these are specific myopia control spectacles that are used to slow the progression and have been found to be effective. So they're not progressive addition lens spectacles. They're not bifocal spectacles. They're special myopia control spectacles. And so what I've done is taken the average results of each of these different areas, and you can see them sort of in comparison to one another, where again, the purple dots indicate how much we're able to slow axial length on average, and the black bars indicate how much we're able to slow refractive error on average. And these numbers here at the bottom indicate the average length of those studies for each of those different modalities. So one of the things you can take a look at is that low concentration atropine seems to have about the same amount of myopia control as multifocal contact lenses. It's less than a tenth of a millimeter of eye growth difference, I should say, or less than a quarter of a diopter of myopia control difference. But it's only measured over 1.2 years on average compared to 2 years for multifocal contact lenses in orthokeratology. But to me, one of the main takeaway points for this particular graph is that there's really not a clinically meaningful difference in terms of which one is best for myopia control. So they're all within about a tenth of a millimeter, all within about a quarter of a diopter, with the potential difference of red light therapy. But again, as I said, there's lots of issues ultimately with red light therapy. So the ones we have available to us in the United States are these three, and there's really not a big, huge clinically meaningful difference. And these lines indicate the average across all 5 of those modalities. Okay, so you can see that they're not far from the average. And I would say, more importantly, we don't know for that particular patient in your chair which one would work best. So based on that and this information that one's not really clinically all that different from any of the others, I say fit the lifestyle of the patient to determine which is the best myopia control parameter for that particular person. Now, here's something that I took a look at in the LAMP study that was actually conducted, where they compared myopia control with 0.01% atropine, 0.025% atropine, and 0.05. I looked at the percent reduction, which isn't typically the way we really look at myopia control anymore, but I wanted to be able to compare refractive error and axial length, so I put them both on the same scale, put them on in terms of percent reduction, and then I compared the percent reductions. You would expect that to be approximately 1-to-1. So if you slow myopia progression by this percent, you would expect to slow eye growth by that same percent. So a 1-to-1 relationship is what we expect. But you can see with 0.01% atropine, we get more than 2 times greater reduction of refractive error than we do with axial length. And as the concentrations get higher, we get closer to that 1-to-1 relationship. And you can see that this line was meant to be on the 1. So I do now know how I messed up those lines on the previous graph. But you can see ultimately that 0.05% atropine provides better equality between reduction in refractive error and reduction in axial length. And I think that's important because that at least helps me understand how I'm slowing myopia progression. And we also have to think about why we're doing myopia control. One of the reasons we're doing it is to try to ultimately reduce the risk of sight-threatening complications, which we think are caused by the eye growing too long. So if we're providing myopia control without slowing eye growth, we might not be getting that same benefit ultimately. So I now choose 0.05% atropine as the go-to concentration for patients. But you might be wondering about the side effects related to that. And this, again, is from the LAMP study. So again, they're comparing 0.05% atropine to 0.025 to 0.01 to placebo. And what they did was they actually gave patients single vision glasses, but they told them, if lights are too bright, if it seems too bright when you go outside or something like that, tell us. We can change your glasses to help make that better. And they also said, if you have trouble reading because it becomes too blurry, tell us. We can change your glasses to make it easier for you to read. And that's all they did. Well, when they did that, they found that 30% of the kids actually on 0.05% atropine said that they needed photochromic lenses because lights were too bright at some point in the day. And so that makes us think that this low concentration atropine, 0.05%, maybe is leading to high amounts of photophobia, and we're not doing our patients any benefit. But when you look at the proportion of people in placebo who needed photochromic glasses, what this ultimately tells me is that they're both about the same. There's no statistically significant difference between them. And that kids are photophobic, just plain and simple, or they like the look of photochromic lenses. I don't know which one it ultimately is, but it tells me that low concentrations of atropine don't make kids additionally photophobic. And I think that's really important. So we lower the risks, still give meaningful myopia control benefits. So I think that's why this is now a viable option for myopia control. And you can see that almost nobody needs help seeing up close. These kids can accommodate a lot. And even if you reduce their accommodative amplitudes, they still have plenty of accommodation in reserve in order to be able to see clearly up close. Now, they asked him about photophobia, and they didn't actually let us know how they asked about photophobia. But initially, you can see that those low concentration atropine kids had statistically significantly more photophobia than the placebo. But after 1 year, there seems to be some adaptation. And so there wasn't any greater proportion of kids who reported photophobia. And again, I don't know how they asked it, so I don't really know the meaning of this. But what it tells me is that kids can adapt to these low concentration atropine. So if they initially report that, lights seem too bright, I wouldn't make changes right away. I would wait to make changes, maybe add photochromic lenses to them if it's necessary, but wait for maybe a month or so. This doesn't give us an indication of how long that adaptation took, but there will be some adaptation. When you see the patients back, ask them again if they're still having problems. So taking eye drops terrifies most kids. So we wonder if, what's the comfort of these eye drops? Should they be scared? Is it terrible for the kids? So a student at Ohio State, Ben Cyphers, actually conducted a study where he compared the comfort of artificial tears, which are indicated in black, to atropine indicated in purple, to proparacaine indicated in gray. And he gave these to actually optometry students, and he had them indicate their comfort on a scale of 1 to 10 immediately after the drop went in. And then 5 seconds later, he said, now what's your comfort level? And 10 seconds later, he said, what's your comfort level? And again, they were rating it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 was no discomfort and 10 was extreme discomfort. So immediately, the least comfortable drop is proparacaine, as you can well imagine. After 5 seconds, there's no difference between proparacaine and atropine. After 10 seconds, the least comfortable drop is actually atropine. And it's not that it was statistically significant increase, but it looks like it increases over time, actually. In other words, it doesn't go away right away. That when you instill proparacaine, that sensation doesn't go away just immediately. It lasts for a while. But I think the important point to take away from this is, on average, it was only a 3 out of 10. So the comfort isn't all that extreme on average. But in just a minute, you're going to see that there's a lot of variability in terms of that comfort. But I think what you can take away from this is they're not all that uncomfortable for patients. But it depends on the individual patient. So this is when Ben looked at the individual patients and their actual reports. And again, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being extreme discomfort, 1 being no discomfort. This is when we just gave them their first drop, the first time of those drops. They then went away and took low concentration atropine every night for 1 week. And at the end, when they came back, we had them report those same things. And you can see that there was some sort of adaptation. But you can also see that there's a lot of variability. Some patients, it got better quickly. Some patients went almost immediately to 1. Some patients took 10 seconds to go to 1. But other patients got worse over that time. So there's a whole bunch of variability. There's one patient here that you can see that was just very uncomfortable, both at the initial visit and at the follow-up visit 1 week later. And we don't know exactly what was different about that patient. Maybe it's just a more dramatic person and they had the same discomfort as everybody else, but they report greater amounts of discomfort. Maybe they had an allergy to the preservatives in the drops. Maybe they had a different pH in their eye that was affected by a different pH in these drops. And so they're always going to be uncomfortable no matter what atropine drops we put in. There's lots of possibilities, but keep in mind that some people just experience way more pain than other patients. And so you have to keep that in mind when prescribing this treatment for patients. And then there's a lot of variability and there's a little bit of adaptation. So you can see that mostly they got better. Most of the patients got better ultimately after 1 week of using low concentration atropine eye drops. But because of those results where the comfort of those low concentration eye drops didn't improve after 10 seconds, actually had a second student, Adam Bayer, who is currently writing his thesis right now and hopes to defend his thesis this summer, where he actually created a MATLAB program that measured continuously every 10th of a second what the patient reported in terms of comfort of their eyes. And again, it was on a scale of 0 this time to 10, where 0 is no discomfort, 10 is severe discomfort. Everybody started off with 0, and what we meant by 0 was their baseline comfort of their eyes, and we told them this at the beginning. So know what your eyes feel like right now. So everybody started off with 0. As soon as we put the drop in, we want you to take the cursor and indicate on that line that goes from 0 to 10 how much discomfort there was, and we measured it every 10th of a second for 25 seconds this time. So one of the things to notice is that the comfort increases again till about that 10-second period, then it slowly starts to get more comfortable over a period of 25 seconds. But he took this opportunity to be able to compare different things to answer some important questions. Excuse me. So one of the first things he compared was between 0.01% atropine and 0.05% atropine to see if there's a difference in comfort. So if somebody's uncomfortable with 0.05, can we make them more comfortable by putting them in 0.01% atropine? And that's these two lines here, and you can see that there's absolutely no difference between the two of them. So changing the concentration doesn't change the comfort of the drops. Second question he looked at was, is there a difference if you use 0.05% atropine between room temperature drops and refrigerated drops? So a lot of us tell our patients, hey, refrigerate the drops to make them more comfortable when you put them in. So he looked to see if there actually was a difference. And we didn't, in this particular graph, we don't have the confidence intervals around this, but if you include the confidence intervals, there actually is no difference between room temperature drops and refrigerated drops. So refrigerating the drops ultimately doesn't help make them more comfortable. It may help with stability. You may be recommended to put the drops in the refrigerator at night for stability, but it doesn't help the comfort of the drops. And then the third question he asked was, he actually used room temperature drops, one from a lab in Columbus, and then room temperature drops of 0.05% atropine from a different lab in Columbus. So two different labs, just to see if the labs make things differently and if it gives different results. And you can see that it gives dramatically different results. So here's the 0.05% atropine at room temperature from lab A, and here's the 0.05% atropine room temperature from lab B. Huge difference between the two, statistically significant. On a scale of 0 to 10, it's about a 1.5 unit difference between the two of them. So comfort matters based on where you get the drops from. And this drop right here is actually the same drop from the same group that we got it for Ben Cipher's study, which we reported here. This drop is from a different lab, ultimately. And the interesting thing is these two labs in Columbus, both providing patients with 0.01% atropine, do it very differently. So this one takes the powder form of atropine and adds solution to it in order to make solution and preservatives to it in order to make it the appropriate concentration of atropine. And we actually use this in another study, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And what we did was we gave the patients their eye drops. We had them use them for a 3-month period. We had them return them because they got 10 ml bottles. And when they returned them, we then sent them off to a lab to make sure that they were still 0.01% atropine, and they were on a very consistent basis. Every single one of the bottles that was brought back was 0.01% atropine. So it was stable, all was good. This one we haven't tested that same way. This one was more comfortable, but this one was made differently. It was actually 1% atropine, which was diluted with artificial tears. And so different labs do it differently, and you're going to see some evidence of that in just a little bit. Now, here is an interesting study, and this isn't using low concentration atropine. This is instead using 1% atropine drops. But the interesting thing about this is, and you probably know this, that atropine binds to the receptors and it's not released from the receptors. It's a permanent binding to the receptor. So the only way to get rid of the effects of atropine are to get rid of the receptors ultimately. And so atropine actually should have its effects over a long period of time. And as you know, if you give patients atropine, their pupils are dilated for a long time. In theory, it takes about 2 weeks for all of the receptors to actually be regenerated in the back of the eye. So in theory, it works for 2 weeks, but really it slowly starts coming down before that because some of the receptors are generated early on in that period, and some of them later on in that period. But because of this, what they did was they put 1 drop of 1% atropine in the right eye, we'll say on the first day of the month. Then they put 1 drop of 1% atropine in the left eye, we'll say on the 16th day of the month. Then the next month back in the right eye on the first day of the month. So in other words, what they did was they only put drops in once a month, and they switched eyes each time they did it. When they did that, they actually found a very meaningful slowing of myopia progression. So from minus 1.29 diopters of myopia progression to 0.27 diopters of myopia progression for patients who got the 1% atropine once a month. And we actually slowed eye growth by about 75%. So it went from 0.41 to 0.11. Now, in this, just looking at these numbers, this is an effective treatment. But if you actually look at the data, what we found is this is huge randomized clinical trial, 660 patients ultimately, but 90 of the patients actually ultimately withdrew, and most of them from the experimental group. So the group that's getting the 1% atropine. So that tells you probably that they're causing photophobia and near complaints, and that's what was actually documented here. Most of the primary reasons that they were dropping out was photophobia and blurred near vision, but also some headaches. But it also tells you that I think people are less tolerant of side effects if their myopia, if they're not getting the benefit of the drop, if their myopia is still progressing relatively quickly. So I think that those side effects could very well be related to myopia progression. So it might be that it looks like we slowed myopia progression in those particular patients, when in reality, we just got rid of the fast progressors. So we have to keep that in mind. It's one of the things to take away from this study, but it is of interest and something that I think deserves replication to see if we can give a drop just basically once a month in each eye and still get meaningful myopia control. So many of you are thinking about using atropine. I think some of the things that you should measure on follow-up visits, and personally, I think I would conduct follow-up visits very similar to what you would do for contact lens follow-up visits if they're wearing frequent replacement contact lenses. So maybe depends on what your comfort level is, 1 week later or 2 weeks later, 1 month later, and then maybe every 6 months if everything is going well. Each of those visits, I would always measure accommodation, measure it in the same way, measure whatever you feel is important, whether that's accommodative amplitudes, accommodative facility, accommodative lag, whatever you are comfortable measuring, but make sure that accommodation is okay and or stable. Measure pupil size. You have to measure it the same way every single time, so you have to have a protocol in place. You can't measure it sometimes with the room lights up and sometimes with room lights down, obviously. So make sure you have a protocol in place. It's questionable about IOP. Ben's study actually found about less than a 1 millimeter difference, but it was statistically significant in eye size after just 1 week of taking atropine. And so you have to decide whether or not that's a meaningful difference. I'd say most people would say clinically that's not meaningful. Statistically, it is significant. But it was only significant in the right eye and not in the left. So keep that all in mind. You may want to measure IOP, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. You can measure near visual acuity, but it's not absolutely necessary because very few people are actually affected. So maybe it's just sufficient to ask patients, are you having any problems reading? And then maybe a standardized method of asking about photophobia so you know ultimately if there are any changes or anything. So keep that in mind. Decide what your comfort level is at 2 weeks, if you want to do a 1 month visit, if you want to do every 6 months. Something like that, but I think you ought to follow these patients on a routine basis, especially since they're young myopes who are probably progressing. So what about combination therapy? There have been lots of studies that have been done about combination therapy, and this was the first one. And their actual conclusion was that combined treatment with atropine and ortho-K is effective because they looked at the p-values. But I guess one of the takeaway points is p-values don't tell you the whole story. Yes, these are all significantly different between orthokeratology and orthokeratology with atropine. But the biggest difference is actually in this group where the fastest progression is with orthokeratology alone. So you have to, or I'm sorry, it's here where the fastest progression is in the combination therapy alone. So you have to keep that in mind. Even though this is significant, it's in the actual opposite direction we would expect. I took the sample size average differences of these and found no difference. So my conclusion after the first one was different from what they concluded, was that it doesn't work. However, subsequent studies have found over a 1 year period about 1/10 of a millimeter less eye growth, that one and this one, both found about the same thing, for the combination therapy than they did for the orthokeratology alone. So when combining atropine with orthokeratology, it does seem to provide better myopia control or better slowing of eye growth ultimately. And this I thought was an interesting and important study because in this study, everybody was put on orthokeratology only. And when they were on, and they were known as fast progressors. So they only got in this study if their eye grew by 1/4 of a millimeter or more in the previous year, which is a significant eye growth. So over a 12-month period, those patients that were put on orthokeratology still grew 0.46 millimeters. But then atropine was added to that, and their eyes only grew 0.14 millimeters over the next year. We know myopia progression slows naturally, so we don't really know a lot about, is that a meaningful effect or not? But they happen to take patients who were only orthokeratology contact lens wearers and who had grown 1/4 of a millimeter or more off treatment before that. And they found that they actually, their eyes grew 0.35 millimeters. And in the next year, they were still only orthokeratology wearers. Their eyes grew 0.25 millimeters. So the difference between those is 0.1 millimeter. So we expect eye growth to slow naturally when on orthokeratology by 0.1 millimeters, but you can see that it actually slowed by about 3.3 millimeters when orthokeratology was added. So that to me says you can do combination therapy and it can be an adjunctive therapy. So you can add a second therapy if you don't think that orthokeratology is providing sufficient benefit. And then Jenny Huang, or now Jenny Jones at Ohio State, conducted a therapy looking at combination therapy of soft multifocal contact lenses with low concentration atropine, 0.01%. And what you can see is the eye growth of kids on single vision contact lenses compared to those on bifocal contact lenses, soft multifocal contact lenses, and those on soft multifocal and low concentration atropine. And you can see that the story is the same whether we're talking about myopia progression or eye growth. And the story is that both of those slow myopia progression and eye growth, but there's not a statistically significant difference between the combination therapy and the monotherapy. I don't really have a good explanation of why it would work for soft multifocal contact lenses as opposed to orthokeratology. I can tell you that this is not a randomized clinical study, and it did find approximately the same difference, about a 0.1 millimeter difference between orthokeratology and between soft multifocal contact lenses and bifocal and atropine, but we did not find that statistically meaningful effect in this particular study. And then combination therapy with these special myopia control spectacles. Here we're taking a look at how much the eye grows in orange for each of these. So single vision, the special spectacles, DIMS lenses, and the special spectacles with atropine versus, and you can follow that basically across to the left axis. If you take the refractive error ones, which are in the red bars or blue bars, you can follow that across to the spherical equivalent refractive error changes. What you see is that there's actually significantly more slowing for DIMS lenses and single vision, and there's significantly more slowing for the DIMS lenses plus atropine than both single vision and DIMS lenses alone. So there seems to be a combination effect for spectacles and for orthokeratology, but maybe not for soft multifocal contact lenses. And one last topic related to atropine and myopia control, and that is, can we delay the onset of myopia with atropine? So these are pre-myopes who were given low concentration atropine, and you can see the progression over an average of about a year, and they just compared it to a group who chose no treatment at all. And you can see that, this is a group with no treatment. This is a group that was given low concentration atropine. You can see that the progression is much faster in the group that has low concentration atropine. And the kids who were on the control group, 54% of them became myopic compared to only 21% over about a 1-year period with 0.025% atropine. Another study didn't actually look at the onset, but looked at the refractive change in a period. And this was a kind of an odd study. It's really difficult to tell what the patients were that they were including in this study, but they found basically the same thing for pre-myopic participants. They found that the refractive shift and the eye growth was less for those kids that they gave atropine. Probably the best study reported to date was reported in JAMA earlier this year. And they actually found that the onset of myopia, so this is as you go higher in this graph, that's more patients that ultimately become myopic. You can see that there's no difference between the placebo group and the 0.01% atropine group, but those given 0.05% atropine became myopic less often. So only 20% of them became myopic compared to basically half of the placebo and 0.01% group. But the question is, will kids before the onset of myopia actually take these eye drops? And it's a difficult thing to answer. They said adherence was if they took eye drops at least 75% of the time, or on average 5.25 days per week. 90% of these kids were actually adherent with their eye drops, as reported by the kids ultimately. But you can see that I think they do take the eye drops, and it does have a meaningful effect over a 2-year period. So I think this is an important thing to look at for the future of myopia control. Can we actually delay the onset of myopia control? And another study that found essentially the same thing, but this was only over a 6-month period. And then they switched the kids from placebo to treatment. But the important point to take away is that the groups that were on the drops are these right here, and 12% of them became myopic in those particular periods, compared to about 40% of them in their particular periods. Or if you look at the fast myopic shift, about 3/4 of them who were in placebo had a fast myopic shift compared to only 40% of those who were on treatment. So this says that there is no ultimate period effect. It doesn't matter whether it was measured in the first 6 months or the second 6 months, but the low concentration atropine does reduce the proportion of myopia onset and the proportion of people who progress quickly. And that's important because for every year younger at onset, in adulthood, you're expected to be almost 1 diopter more myopic, or 3 times more likely to be a high myope. So if we can just delay the onset of myopia, we might have a very meaningful effect, although this hasn't been directly measured over a long period of time. This is taking a look at myopes as adults and asking when they became myopic previously. And then I talked earlier about sort of getting drops compounded at pharmacies. Every pharmacy does it different, and that's what basically Catherine Richdale and colleagues Mark Bullimore and Aaron Tomiyama found in their particular study when they asked compounding pharmacies to report what they did and some various components of their eye drops. So you can see that they provide them in a variety of different bottle sizes. Some of them recommend refrigerating them, some of them don't. Some of them don't let you use the drops beyond 14 days, but some of them not beyond 180 days. They're making them with various styles, and they have various active ingredients. So compounding pharmacies don't all do it the same, and that's one thing you have to keep in mind when prescribing these. So these are the summary takeaway points. I think that it is that low concentration atropine slows myopia progression, doesn't do quite as good of a job of slowing eye growth. Right now, 0.05% atropine is what you should start with and reduce if necessary. Allow people to adapt to the drops before you make any changes. Cooling eye drops doesn't make them any more comfortable ultimately. It might make them more stable. I don't know about that as much. Combination therapy is effective seemingly with orthokeratology and dim lenses, but for some reason not as much with soft multifocal contact lenses. And delaying the onset of myopia is where we might be headed in terms of myopia control. So beware of compounding atropine because it can be different as we go along. Stephanie, I will answer any questions. I probably created more questions than I have.
Yes.
Try to provide more clarity.
This is always such a great lecture that you do because there's so many different studies and you're always adding in, what's the newest research. So when you give this talk again in 5 years, it's going to be very different than the one you gave today. So that always creates a lot of questions. So we only have 5 minutes for questions. So Jeff, what I was thinking is I can ask you and you could just rapid fire your answer so we can get through as many as we can.
Yep.
Cool. All right. First, patient is on 0.01% atropine with MyoSmart, but they're still progressing. Should I switch to 0.05% or 0.025%? And how long should I keep this patient on before switching modalities?
I recommend 0.05%. I think it's the best. And then if you have to, reduce it ultimately, but that's what I would recommend.
Great. When do you start and stop atropine therapy?
I think you should start atropine therapy right now as soon as they become myopic. In the future, once we know a little bit more, I think we might be able to start it once we measure the refractive error, and we might be doing this in pre-myopes. Those people are most likely to become myopic. But right now, as soon as they become myopic.
Excellent. How long and slowly do you recommend tapering 0.5%? And I don't know if it really is 0.5 or if they meant 0.05, I'm not sure. Atropine to minimize rebound effects.
A lot of people are saying that that's what we should do, but with absolutely no evidence. There's no evidence to show that tapering reduces rebound. There actually is evidence to show that we don't get rebound with these low concentration atropine. So I don't honestly understand why people are tapering.
Great. That's excellent. I feel like that comes up a lot. Dr. Walline, there is a 10-year Russian study with low-dose atropine. If you're familiar with that, what's your point of view?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that, but I'll have to look it up. If somebody
I didn't know either.
I would appreciate it. It's walline.1@osu.edu. I'd love to see more.
Yeah, me too. Is there an affordable option for low-dose atropine? A lot of my patients are on Medicaid. They can't afford it. Do you have any suggestions?
Unfortunately, I know that in I think it's Alabama, Medicaid actually covers atropine. It just blows my mind. So find out what happens in your particular area. But no, unfortunately, there aren't any good ideas of what you can do if people can't afford it. I honestly think we're making myopia control a premium, and which means that it's only affordable by those privileged people. And I really think as optometrists, we owe it to the people who are less privileged to provide them with the care that they need. And so, for every 10 patients that you provide care for and they're paying patients, maybe we should think about providing charitable care for some patients. The other thing potentially is 1% atropine given once a month, switching between eyes. That was effective in that one study. That would be much less expensive. Maybe that's something people could consider. So those are my two things. Unfortunately, the only two ideas that I have.
I heard there is an FDA approved option coming out for low dose atropine. What is going on with that?
I think we're a ways away from that. I think, as far as I know, which isn't very far, somebody just applied for approval. And so it's a long process. And so we don't know what the results will ultimately be. So I honestly don't know. I hope that something comes in the not too distant future. And by that, I mean in the next year, but that would be a best case scenario. And I have no idea ultimately what the FDA will decide.
Great. Last question. If we want to get started with myopia management, how important is it to measure axial length? I have an office that doesn't have it. Can we still treat myopia management with just refraction? Just any comments on that?
I beg of you to still do myopia control, even if you don't have a way to measure axial length. Axial length is not necessary for measuring myopia control in any modality, including orthokeratology. If you just take a look at the change in base curve that you use, that'll give you an idea if you're actually slowing eye growth or not, ultimately. I think, though, what Axial Link does is it gives you a little additional information that can make it easier. So if you're doing a lot of myopia control, then you might consider actually adding, buying some sort of biometer, but you still can do myopia control even if you can't measure the length of the eye. Absolutely, 100%.
So moral of the story, just do something, just take action. Even if you don't have all the fancy equipment, we owe it to our patients to help slow down their myopia as much as we can.
Hallelujah.
Yay! Well, that was a great one to end on. I love it. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Walline, for sharing your insights. It was a pleasure having you. Thanks for educating us.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.